Do we start with God or do we start with the self? Okay. You need to point out that that actually commits. And we can use the language of R.C. Sproul. It commits the classical fallacy known as the false dichotomy, right? That's my bad impression of R.C. Sproul. It's a false dichotomy. You either start with man or you start with God. You can't start with God, so therefore you have to start with man. No. You start with God or you start with man. The answer is not that you start with God or man. The answer is you start with both simultaneously. Man consciousness and God consciousness. The only way to meaningfully make sense out of our own consciousness is to understand it within the context of the ontological reality of God himself. Okay? This is the whole presuppositionalist confuse epistemology with ontology. Okay? So he says, nobody starts with God except God. You can't start with God unless you're God. We start with self-consciousness, he says, and then from self-consciousness, you move to the existence of God. And by necessity, he says, human beings thinking with human minds must start with their brain. Okay? Now, you have to also point out that there is an equivocation with the phrase to start with. For there are very different ways in which we can use the phrase start with, and presuppositionalists have made these distinctions. Okay? All right? You can start with something temporally and logically. There's temporal order and logical order. So you can start with something in a chronological sense. That is not what presuppositionalists mean when we say that you start with God, not with man. We're not thinking in terms of chronological starting with. Okay, rather, we are understanding start with respect to the distinction between proximate starting points and ultimate starting points. Okay, it is a logical order, not a chronological order. Okay, you can start with something temporally, you can start with something logical. You have temporal order, logical order, proximate starting points versus ultimate starting points. You can start with something in practice, and you could start with something in principle. Okay, when we say that we start with the entire Christian worldview, right? We're starting with God, the Christian worldview. We are referring to a logical order and not a temporal one. And the equivocation in this phrase becomes clear when the objector says something like this. Someone will say, well, you have to rely on your senses before you read your Bible. Now, obviously, the term before in this case is referring to a temporal order. But we must think, as I'm mentioning here, more in terms of what we call logical priority, not temporal or chronological priority. Our senses, reason, logic, etc., may come first temporally, but God and his revelation take preeminence over those other beliefs. So to summarize this point, when we say to start with, we start with our faculties. And I'm not saying anything weird and new. I mean, Bahnsen touches on this, and it's explained. Even Bahnsen says, we start with ourselves as a proximate starting point. Okay, he uses that language, proximate starting points. Okay, so we start with our faculties temporally, but we start with God logically. Our faculties are our proximate starting point, but God is the ultimate starting point. We may start with our faculties in practice, but we start with God in principle. Okay, that is a huge, important thing to keep in mind. Okay, Van Til did not confuse epistemology with ontology. Okay, he said, quote, Van Til said, you either predicate knowledge upon an ontology, a view of reality, constructed speculatively by humans, or you predicate knowledge upon the ontology revealed by the triune God.